This is the title of a collection of stories that was published 2 years after Agnon died. It's a very big book. It contains about 140 stories. And all the stories are about Buchach. But not Buchach of Agnon's childhood, but Buchach from the end of the 17th century, mostly the 18th century, to the middle of the 19th century. And these are stories that Agnon worked on in the last 10 or 15 years of his life. And it's actually the project that I've been working on. I've written a book about it, and I've edited translations of most of the stories that have just appeared in English. And so it's an aspect of Agnon that's very interesting to me. So as we said, he began writing in 1905, and he wrote until he died in 1970. But in the last years of his life, he decided that he wanted to go back to the town that he came from in his mind, in his imagination, to Buchach, and to try to, in a sense, bring it back to life, or rethink it or reimagine it through stories. And again, it's not from the Buchach that he knew when he was a child, which would have been at the end of the 19th century, but it's the Buchach of the classical period of Polish Jewry. In other words, the generation after Khmelnytsky until the partition of Poland, and then from the partition of Poland until the middle of the 19th century, when Jews and other minorities were given the vote. So that he wanted to look at Buchach before it became a modern place, at the time when Jews still lived under the authority of rabbis and of Jewish law. What is so interesting to me about the project is that he wanted to do it using fiction, modern fiction, rather than ethnography or memoir. So he wants to use the tools that he had developed as a modern writer, that is the modern story, and take that medium of the modern story and go back to the pre-modern period and try to bring that back to life in a series of stories, a series of about 140 stories. For Agnon, this was, I believe, his response to the Holocaust, to the Shoah. And it's very interesting to my mind because it, in a sense, changes what we think about as Holocaust literature, Shoah literature. Usually when we think about Shoah literature, we think about literature that describes how the Jews died, the destruction of the Jewish community. So that, in a sense, if you define what Shoah literature is, it's a literature about how the Jews were pursued and put into ghettos, and how they were killed, how they responded themselves, perhaps how they, what their life was like as survivors or their children. But it's all about destruction. Agnon took a very different path. He wanted to describe, or his way of dealing with the murder of European Jewry was to try to recreate Jewish life in its fullness. And that's the title of the story, A City in Its Fullness, which is a translation of a phrase from the Bible, Ir Umeloah. So he thought that what was most important was to try to bring back to life what was lost, rather than to describe the processes during which Jewish life was was destroyed. He was also very aware that in the case of Galician Jewry, there were in a sense two destructions. What came before the Shoah was World War I and the Civil War and the Pellitura, I can't get the name right. Galician Jewry was not eliminated, but its life was seriously reduced in the process of World War I. In fact, Agnon wrote a novel called A Guest for the Night, which is about a figure like Agnon who goes from Palestine back to Buchach and spends a year there trying to bring some life back to Buchach. So again, he wanted to focus on Buchach in its golden age, in its classical period, and not in the period of its decline and its destruction. In order to tell these stories, Agnon also had to develop a new kind of narrator, a storyteller. It couldn't be an Agnon-like figure. Where is this coming from? Outside?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because he's talking about events that took place in the middle of the 18th century. So he's not a witness to it. He can't even say that, my father and my grandfather, it's longer ago. So he invents a narrator who is doesn't have a name, somewhat different in each story, but who belongs to the period, who is a traditional Jew who is telling these stories. So I'm giving you this background because the story we read today, Pisces, or Mazal Dagim, is in that collection. It comes toward the end of it. The collection is arranged in historical order, and this is among the last stories. And in fact, the date in which the events of the story take place are given in the story. It's in the 1860s, very much at the end of this period. And this is a story that is different from many of the other stories because it has a kind of comic, carnivalesque, highly satirical quality to it, but it is part of that collection. So I want to begin with what the meaning of the title is. Right? The title is Pisces, in Hebrew Mazal Dagim. And what is that? What is Pisces? How do you say it in Russian? Or is it yeah. And what is it referred to?
One of the symbols of zodiac.
One of the symbols of the zodiac, right? Which month or what period is Pisces? Is anybody here a Pisces?
Adar.
Anybody born? Is that your sign? Anybody?
No.
It's mine actually. I was born in February, late February. Okay.
This is the end of February and March.
Right. So it coincides with the Hebrew month of Adar, and Adar is the month in which the holiday of Purim falls. So that's one of the important associations with the idea of Pisces or Mazal Dagim is Purim. And that's very appropriate to the story because Purim is about dressing up, it's about eating, and it's about what we call in English turnabout, when a situation changes dramatically, the way in which the Jews are in danger, and then all of a sudden they're saved at the end. Evel Liyom Tov. So Purim is one of the strong associations with the title Mazal Dagim. It's also if you remember what the sign looks like itself, it's always two fish, kind of like that, you know. Very good, yes. It's important here because it's all about pairs. Two things together and two in a reversal as well. And if you think about the story, there are many pairs. There's official carp and the fish. That's one important pair. And then there is official and Bezalel Moshe, the boy artist, is another important pair. So that pairing and reversing is also very important. And a third meaning of the sign of Mazal Dagim is also fertility, of having children, productivity. Jews eat fish and fish heads, especially in Rosh Hashanah, as a sign of having children, of multiplying. It's a very, very strong symbol. And that in the story is interesting because there is no fertility or productivity in the story. There's death, and it's an ironic relationship, a negative relationship to the events that take place in the story. So, I'm sure you noticed that aside from Bezalel Moshe, all the names of the men in the story have what in common? What is?
They have two names.
They have two names. That's pretty common in Jewish names. But what is common of all the male names? What they mean, what they come from.
Fish, his name, Fishitel Carp.
Official carp.
And Fishitel, it's something
Fish.
holy. But carp is usual fish, which is only in this small river, which was even named as a river only in respect to Buchach. So it's
Isn't carp eaten everywhere? It's not just in...
But it's usual fish.
Okay, but it's a well-known fish. And then there are other people like Schleim and others. Everybody, all the men in Buchach have fish names. Okay, so fish are very important here. But Bezalel Moshe, the boy, does not, but official carp does. So when we're first introduced to the official carp, he's introduced as a larger-than-life character. I wanted to read the opening here. And again, this is a story which is satiric, and it's a comedy of sorts, but it's also very serious. Official carp was a householder. It means he's a Bal Habayit. Householders like him are not found in every generation, nor in every place. Tall was he, and as his height, so was his breadth. Means that he was as fat as he was tall. That is, his height equaled his circumference. Of similar amplitude were his limbs. His neck was fat, and as they say among us in Buchach, it measured up to the forearm of Agnon, the king of Moab. That's from the Bible. Agnon was thought to be a giant, a great warrior. But the fact that his body parts are compared to a Gentile king in the Bible is also very kind of interesting here. This, apart from his belly, which was a creature by itself, such a belly is not to be found in our generation. But even in officials' generation, it was numbered among the city's novelties. And it goes on to talk about even the merchants from Lemberg, from Lviv, would come and they have never seen a belly like this. So Fischl is described as if his belly stands for the man, as if the belly is a creature, an independent creature unto itself. And the narrator works very hard at the beginning of the story here to portray Fischl as a man who is entirely equal to his body, and that his body is one big mechanism of hunger for gorging himself, for gluttony. And I was trying to think of, I don't know the word in Russian, when you eat and eat and eat. Okay, there's, in Hebrew it's lizlol, zlila, and that's the word that's used here. So the whole kind of rhetorical mood at the beginning of the story is exaggeration, or what we call hyperbole. In other words, everything is larger, everything is more. There's never been anybody like Fischl. There's never been a belly like his. It was one of the wonders of the world, this belly. And the narrator describes it not critically, but as a question of a marvel, a wonder, something that has never been seen before. And then we get a description of what Fischl's life is like. One detail before we say that. How does he support himself? How does he make a living? What's his profession?
Moneylender.
He's a moneylender. Okay, that's important. Because he's, in a sense, he lives off of other people, right? And he's very wealthy from this. And he's a man whose every waking hour is devoted to what? Well, to eating, but also to, he can't eat all the time. But in fact, one of the really interesting things about the story is, does he eat anything in the story?
No.
Only the best.
Only what?
The best, maybe.
Like in this story.
The biggest and the best food.
But not in the story itself. This is what we know about him, but within the action of the story, he doesn't put anything in his mouth. Either does Batsalo Moshe, except for some cherries that he buys as well. So he eats, he wants to eat all the time, and the rest of the time, his imagination is all about planning what he's going to eat. He gets up in the morning and he's excited because he's going to go to the market on his way to the synagogue, and who knows, what he's going to find there, and then once he gets the fish, all he can think about is his wife, the different ways she might be able to prepare the fish, and what his gigantic breakfast is going to be like afterwards. So he's a man who's entirely identified with his belly, with thinking. The only thinking or consciousness he has is a projection of his hunger and his planning and his fantasies about what he's going to eat. So this is a person who is entirely identified with his body and with appetite and with hunger. There's no other dimension. And in fact, this faculty of hunger and appetite takes over everything. It takes over his religious life as well. So he is somebody who is an observant Jew, but he, in a sense, takes all of the Jewish observance and he brings it within his appetite. So he prides himself in the fact that because he eats so much, he gets to make so many blessings. Jews make a blessing before they eat. So in his own eyes, he is a very religious person because he makes blessings all day long, because he's eating all day long. So he's taken the spiritual dimension of Judaism and brought it within his bodily appetites. So he is somebody who wants to swallow everything, take everything into himself and into his belly. And the fact that he's a moneylender says something about his relationship to other people as well, because he's in a sense swallowing them or using them. So, we said that the story is about exaggeration and hyperbole, but one of the questions is this man exceptional, singular, special, or is he a representative of the society of Buchach? And the story, I think, really tries to say to us that even though he's spoken about as there's nobody like him in the world, he in a sense represents what is the material, this worldly aspect of this society. That he is in a sense an example or a paragon of what the life of Buchach is like. That people perhaps aren't as big as he is, and they're not as rich as he is, and they may not think about food all the time, but it's a critique of the life of this society, that everything is about material appetite, everything is about acquiring and swallowing. And aside from B'Tselem Moshe here, we don't see anything that is truly spiritual at all. So it's a story which is very critical of the society by taking this man and making him a representative of the society rather than somebody who is an exception. Now, the story also is a story which goes outside the bounds of realism. And what is fantastic or what we call kind of magic realism about this story?
Describing the fish.
Describing the fish, right? Because we have several chapters here which is told from the point of view of this very large fish and how the fish experiences the world. Right? And the thinking of the fish at every moment. Okay? And that story begins with the fish swimming in the Dnieper and going up and down, and then deciding that he's going to explore a tributary of the Dnieper, the Stripa, to see what it's like there. And in the Stripa, usually there are little fish because it's smaller, and he is gigantic. And how does he conduct himself, this fish? He doesn't have a name. He's just the fish. How does he move about? What's his relationship to the world?
He's the dominate fish, he's an emperor fish.
The alpha fish.
Alpha fish, yes.
Alpha fish, right. And he opens his mouth, and
also swallowing.
He's swallowing all the other fish. And what's his attitude toward the other fish? And how do they relate to him?
They serve to him, they are dominated.
Yeah, and they're trying to flatter him, and they're trying to stay out of his way, and because they're all bowing down to him, hoping that they won't be eaten by him. He's also a fish who would seem to be exceptional as well, and he has a history. What are his origins? What is his lineage? This fish.
From the history of prophet
from Jonah, the book of Jonah. Jonah gets swallowed by not a whale, but it just says a big fish in the Bible, right? And so it's from that fish and from the fish that were swallowed by that fish. So he's not only very powerful, but he has a very distinguished family lineage as well. And he, because he is so big and powerful, he assumes that he is untouchable, that nothing at all can affect him, that he is all-powerful, and that is what puts him in harm's way. That's what's responsible for his being caught eventually. Because how does he get caught in the net of the fishermen in Buchach? Why does he let himself get caught?
The fish was very curious, but he never saw anything like
He's never seen a net before. He's curious, and there's never been anything that's been able to enclose him. So fish nets are totally, unfamiliar and foreign to him. And he's almost about to be taken in by the net. And the other fish are of two parties. Remember, some of them want to save him, and others are very happy that he gets caught, because then there won't be this, dominant fish around. And eventually he's caught. And then the story gets very fantastical, because we hear the thoughts of the fish. And in fact, the fish has these spiritual thoughts. It's very strange. And part of the story I don't quite understand, that as he's being taken up in the net, and as he's losing the oxygen, he begins to have more mystical thoughts. And he says, oh, this must be what's called the ascent of the soul. This is what people say about this. And the fish is not a Jewish figure, but he has thoughts that seem to come from Jewish mysticism. It's very interesting, and it's not part that I really understand. And then this great creature is brought low and humiliated, and the life begins to go out of him slowly. It's a very humiliating death until he is sold by the fishermen to Moshe, to official car. So, why do you think the Agnon writes a story that has such a big fish in it? What do you think the function of this fish is in the story?
Because this fish in a pair with our main hero.
Right, and this is what we talked about with the twins, the doubling. So we're meant to see a mirror image or a connection between the official carp with its gigantic belly and its gigantic appetites and the fish himself. And what are some of the parallels between these two figures, between official carp and the fish?
Fish lives on other fishes as carp. Superior. As carp lives on the money of other people.
Yeah, they both have a exploitative. They're using up others, right? That's for sure. What else is connected between them?
their appearance.
Right,
They're
they're
really
both gigantic. That's right. And what about the question of eating and appetite and hunger?
Swallow everything.
A little louder.
They try to swallow everything what they.
Yes, and that's all they do. In other words, that a fish is an animal. Animal spends all its time trying to survive by eating. That's what animals do, and that's what the big fish does. Yeah.
And I think that the title of the novel is Mazal Dagim, the hero that explains the two, like Mazal. It's not only symbol of zodiac, but just not Goral, but it's like life.
Right.
Mazal,
What the
two
fate?
dogs, so we have two dogs official and real.
Right.
Real
So I think
fish.
that's a good point. Mazal also means fate or destiny,
Yeah.
what the result of what
Or
happens.
fortune of fish.
Fortune, fortune or destiny. I think that's.
So, and we have two fishes, official and
Yes.
fish.
And
Well, two.
and we're shown that because his name is Fishel. So it's, you know, it's very explicit. And what happens with the eating, swallowing, what we know about the fish is that the fish is, in a sense, a cannibal. You have that word in Russian also. When you, somebody who eats other people, it's a cannibal, right? Is it in Russian the same? Or cannibal? Okay. Because what he does is he goes there with his mouth open and eats other fish. That's what fish do, and so forth. So this helps us in the comparison and the analogy to understand Fishel. Fishel is somebody who his appetites are about eating others, eating everything. And it goes from eating everything to eating yourself, consuming yourself, a kind of self-cannibalization. And in the end, he consumes himself through his appetites. There's another connection between Fishel and the fish, which has to do with the ritual objects of the tefillin. Now, let me just explain this. Some of you know about this, some of you don't. But men over the age of 13 are supposed to put on black straps with black leather boxes every morning. And there are two sets. One set goes on the arm and the hand. That's the arm part, and the other goes on the head. And the term for this is tefillin. But not everybody knows that this is plural, and the singular of tefillin is tefillah, which is the same word for prayer. So, and if you read this in the Hebrew, it's the tefillah shel yad and the tefillah shel rosh. And so they're also a pair of two, right? And you put both of them on in the morning prayers. Now, the comic situation here is that after buying the fish, Fishel puts the fish in this kind of bag or sack, which is made out of the hide or the skin of a whole animal, of some kind of calf. And where did that calf come from? Do you remember?
He has eaten.
This calf, and that's why he became sick and...
To get out of the army.
Yeah.
In other words, most people who try to get out of the army starve themselves, right? But he knew that he couldn't go in that direction. That was a non-starter, so he ate and ate and ate and ate a whole calf and was able to get out of the army. And I'll just say in parenthesis that this was a very big issue for Jews in Galicia, because before 1772, under the Poles did not have a central army. You know, every duke had his own army, and they had no interest in having Jews be soldiers. But after 1772, when Austria took over Galicia, that's one of the things that the Austrians insisted upon, not just the Jews, but everybody else, that a certain number of young people, young men, serve in the army. And the service was somewhere between 11 and 14 years. It was not the same thing as the Cantonists in Russia. That was a little different. But, and this was something that struck terror in the Jewish communities. Nobody wanted their son to go away, you know, not be able to observe the laws of Judaism and be distant from Jewish communities for a long time. So people did many things. The Jewish communities usually paid money to poor people to serve in the army, so that the people who had money, or that the scholars would not have to serve. It was a very big issue about equality and inequality, which Agnon deals with in his stories. Say something. And just incidentally, I told you when we talked about the biography of Agnon, that Agnon left Wuchach in 1905 when he was 20 years old and went to Palestine. So the way that he presents it is that he was making aliyah, he was making an ascent to Palestine. But perhaps it really has to do with not wanting to serve in the army. In other words, he knew that he had to leave Wuchach to avoid serving the army. And Palestine was a place that he was interested in going to, but the reason had a lot to do with avoiding army service also. So this is a very big theme for stories about Jewish communities at the time. But to go back, so that's where his bag comes from. Most people, most men, have a bag about this size for their talit and for the tefillin. So he has, everything about him is gigantic, and he has a gigantic, and it's big enough to put this gigantic fish. He puts the fish in there together with his tefillin. He goes to the synagogue. He spent so much time in the market that he's already late, and the services are finished for the morning. So he's going to pray privately, without the benefit of the minyan. And what he does is he gives the fish to this orphan, Batzal Moshe, and says, "Take it back to my wife." And then he stays to pray. But when he looks in his bag, what does he find?
There's only one.
There's only one. Which one is there? Only the one for the arm, and not for the head. And he doesn't know what to do. And he begins looking in all of the closets of the synagogue to see if maybe somebody had left another set of tefillin. He can't find it. And the narrator says, if he were really a more knowledgeable Jew, he would know that you can also pray with one. It's not two, but one. But he didn't know enough, so he thought that once he put the arm one on, and then discovered he didn't have the head, and he's going around and he doesn't know what to do, and he's not speaking because he doesn't want to introduce an interruption, and he's going crazy, and then he begins to go home. So this is the premise, that the head tefillah is left in the bag with the fish, and that's how it gets separated. And this is all in the question of the parallels between official and the fish. One of the parallels is the fish has one of his tefillin, the head one, and official has one for the arm. So they each have one. That's another connection between the two of them. Okay. There have been many critics reading this story, such as one of my teachers, Gershon Shaked, who, when trying to understand the atmosphere of the story, used the great Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin and his concepts of the carnivalesque. Is that in Russian also? Carnival? Okay. And grotesque. Carnivalesque and grotesque. And I think it's a very good application to it. There's much about the whole story and official, which is about kind of carnival. But it's a imperfect or partial idea, because when Bakhtin was using the idea of the carnivalesque was that there was, the main text was Rabelais, the French writer, and about how in the Middle Ages there was a kind of life force, a wisdom that come from the people below that expresses itself in this, these moments of breaking the boundaries and of dressing up and of eating and of giving release to the senses and to the appetites and to sexuality. And the way that Bakhtin presents that is that the carnivalesque is something of a life force. It's a force of renewal, of release, of liberation, something naturally that comes up from the people and breaks forth. And that's actually not what's going on here, because there's nothing in Fischl's appetites which is productive. It's not a renewal of something. It's not a, let's say, a breaking of bourgeois norms or the norms of the aristocracy. It's really that kind of feeding and self-feeding and exploitation of others and the reduction of life only to the senses. So the humor here is, we could use the idea of carnivalesque, but only to a certain degree. The grotesque is very helpful, because the grotesque as an idea is about how the boundaries between human beings and animals are often erased. And here we have that in the connection between the great fish and Fischl carp. So, if the fish and Fischl carp are one of the two pairs in the story, the other pair is Betzalel Moshe and Fischl carp. So Betzalel Moshe is a poor boy. What do we know about his background? We know a little bit about...
His father died?
Pardon?
His
father died, right? How did his father die?
He fell from the church.
From the church roof, right? And why did he fall?
Some people said that he was drunk.
But it's also may have been because he was so hungry that he was delirious. So he's very poor. He's an orphan, and comes from a father who was poor. And the father was fixing the roof not because he wanted to, but because he had no other. The only way that he could make money. So you would think that there could be no greater difference than between this rich man who eats all the time and between this poor orphan. But in fact, there are connections. What do they have in common that's connected between them? What does Betzalel Moshe think about most of the time? Exactly. In other words, he also, like Fischl, is consumed by the question of how is he going to find anything to eat. So in a town, a shtetl like Buchach, what happens when somebody becomes an orphan? We don't have orphanages or houses like that. The community makes arrangements. So what happens here is that the shamash of the study house finds families for him to eat with on different days, and he actually sleeps in the Beit Midrash. But it's a very imperfect arrangement. So some days he's invited to homes to eat, and some days he's not. There's nothing he can depend upon, and there are long stretches where he just has nothing to eat, where he's So he is somebody who does not want to be in the situation of thinking about his belly all the time, but he has to be. And he tries to work, and what are the little things that he does to produce a few pennies?
Mizrach.
So he draws Mizrach. We've talked about that in the story of in the prime of her life. And what other objects does he?
He's an artist, but just in the beginning of doing art.
Right. So he makes all sorts of things that we're in the period now between Passover and Shavuot, where you count the Omer, and so there's
sketches on
a kind of a device or wall hanging that helps you remember what day it is. And there are many things like this that it's a little what we call cottage industry. He gets a few pennies for doing this. It's all he can do. So in the hierarchy of the town of Buchach, he is really at the bottom. He has no parents. He has no way of supporting himself. He ekes out a little living by these drawings. When Fischl Karp comes into the Beit Midrash to find somebody to take the fish back to his wife, he finds him drawing the sign of the fish, of the Mazal Dagim. And what does he say to the boy? He looks at the drawing and he says,
"It's not the fish, the real fish."
"You call that a fish? This is, that's terrible. And why is it not good? Why can't he draw a good likeness of a fish?"
Because boy never seen real fish.
He's never seen a real fish.
Yes.
Exactly. And so Fischl Karp is so condescending, and he wants to say real fish is a real fish, and sends him home with the fish. And that is the premise of the story. And also, when he eventually brings the fish home to Bezalel's, to Fischl Karp's wife, Henshi, she takes the fish, and she doesn't even give him a penny. There's nothing for his trouble. Right? So, on one level, there is a real common ground between the two of them, in that they're both conscious of their bellies all the time, but it goes in different directions. For Fischl Karp, this is the embodiment of his life, is eating all the time. But with Salam Moshe, it's because he would like to be doing his art and drawing, and he does, but he is totally preoccupied by how he's going to survive from one day to the next. So, the story becomes more serious when the focus is on Bezalel Moshe, because he is a boy who has a yearning or desire to draw. He does not have the instruments, or he doesn't have the experience to see the objects themselves, and he's hungry all the time. And suddenly, something new happens. He's given this fish, and we see him on the way, not following through on his mission of bringing it to Fischl's home, but he stops by the side of the road with the fish. And why does he do that? What happens between him and the fish?
He's looking at this fish as an object not to eat, but to observe how this fish and also he is trying to understand fish feelings.
I don't know about the feelings part, but exactly as you said, this is an enormous opportunity for him, because he is seeing the thing itself, the object that he has, is part of the iconography of Jewish life, the Mazal Dagin, but he's never seen one. And so this is an enormous opportunity. So he observes the fish, and it is a transformative moment for him. And we'll read in a little while about how he looks at the fish. And he looks at the fish in a certain way, with a similar kind of intensity that Fischl looks at the fish. But Fischl looks at the fish to think about swallowing it and eating it. And Betzalel Moshe looks at the fish, and in a sense he swallows it with his eyes, but for an entirely different purpose. Because he wants to be able to draw it, he wants to be able to look into not the soul of the fish, but the ideal of the fish, or the form of the fish. And he wants to be able to fix it in his mind, because for him as an artist, this is a chance just to see the greatest representation that you could of the fish itself. Now, it's very important in this story that Betzalel Moshe represents the idea of the artist. Now, as you know, in traditional Jewish society, there isn't a thing or a role for an artist. We have craftspeople, somebody who, let's say, might make, the ark for the synagogue and paint and so forth. But the idea of art, or the artist, is not something that is part of traditional Jewish thought. We spoke before about religious poetry, piyut, when we spoke in the discussion of Edo Ve'enam and the piyut. And that, I would say, is what sacred art is in Judaism. It's mostly in words, used to adorn the synagogue service. And even visual art, drawings in synagogues, and in Eastern Europe there are wonderful decorations in the synagogues that haven't been destroyed and so forth. All of that is art in the service of the synagogue, of sacred life. The idea of art as something which creates beauty, and beauty being something in and of itself that is important, is a modern idea. It's not an idea that's internal to Judaism. In Judaism, representation serves the holy. And this is one of the great dividing lines between traditional Judaism and the modern world. The Enlightenment, the Haskalah, in the 18th and 19th century, the new idea was that in Jewish life, the beautiful should have a value unto itself. That sculpture or painting or poetry that is not religious poetry is a positive value that should be part of the natural life of any people or any nation, and that art is something that does not have to only serve religious ends. It's a very, very big difference between tradition and modernity. In Judaism, in other words, in the West, coming from Greece, from the Greek tradition, in the Greek tradition, the beautiful is in itself a value or something that's important. And that carries over in the church in the Renaissance, in the discovery of human forms, and painting also in the service of the church, but beauty for itself as well, as part of the tension between Hellenism and Christianity as well. In Judaism, it's something of a different story. So here we have within the traditional world a young man who yearns to draw and to paint. His world of reference is not Raphael or Da Vinci or any of the great painters. He doesn't know anything about that. It's something that is a kind of inherent interest in drawing representations of the world. And so we have in this story this transformative moment where he can make this jump to becoming an artist. And so what happens with this? It's not simply a question of being able to see a fish and be able to draw it carefully. That's part of it. But there's another dimension here which has to do with the term form or tsura here. And this is the form that's really connected to Greek ideas of an idea or an ideal type which is above or in back of or beneath the thing we see. So there's a fish, and you can draw a fish very realistically, and you can become an artist who can get every nuance and scale. But then there is the ideal of the fish, or an ideal type. And that is what Betzalel Moshe moves between. And there's really a difference here between the Aristotelian idea of mimesis, mimesis meaning copying a representation, and a Neoplatonic idea of, according to Plato, the things we see are kind of material or earthly copies of ideals or ideal types. And Neoplatonic is, in the later period of the Hellenistic era, the idea that there's a continuum that goes from the material to the spiritual. The spiritual we can't see as the ideal type, and reality is trying to move from the material to the spiritual. So what Betzalel Moshe is able to do is he's moving from copying, from the mimesis or mimetic art to a kind of mystical experience where he sees the ideal of the fish. And what's interesting is he said it says, so when God creates the world in the Bible, in the 6 days of creation, and he creates the fish, it says here that God did not created the fish, but he did not fulfill the idea of the fish, and that is what the artist does. The artist takes what was created and tries to move toward the ideal of the thing that's beyond the material object. In some ways, he takes what God gives and tries to realize the potential within it. He becomes God's partner. So art here is perceived of as not a kind of iconoclasm of rebellion against religious ideas, but rather a furthering, taking God's intention to a higher level by realizing the potential in the fish that's part of the created world. And he has that experience. Now, and what's interesting is when he has this experience and his hands are trembling because he wants to draw, what's his problem? What prevents him from...
He doesn't have paper.
He doesn't have paper. He reaches in his pocket and he finds some piece of chalk or something like that. And instead of paper, he draws on the fish. But when he goes to draw on the fish, what does he end up drawing?
The face of Fischl.
The face of Fischl. So what's interesting here is that he is making this connection between Fischl and the fish. He does that also by putting the tefillah on the fish as well. And just to digress for a moment, what allows him to use the sacred object and put it on the fish is that he assumes that the tefillah that's left in the bag, the head one, is one that's broken or it's been disqualified, that's not being used anymore. It's no longer a holy object. In part because it's so badly maintained. It's all greasy and doesn't look black anymore. It's supposed to maintain its blackness. Because if he had thought that it was really the one that Fischl uses every day, that's still a holy object, he would never think of putting on a fish as in a moment of. But he assumes that it's been kind of disqualified from use, pasul. Now, what he does in making this connection between Fischl and the fish turns out to be very powerful, because what happens at the end of the story, as you remember, is Fischl returns home. He has the one tefillah on his arm, and he's trying to stop talking. But once he gets to his house, he sees a lot of people gathering around, and he is very perplexed about what has happened. His daughter, his youngest daughter, comes out, and she assumes he knows, and she says, "Papa, don't you know?" He doesn't know. And he's so upset by what he sees of the dead fish, or the fish with the tefillin on it, that he has a stroke, and he loses his power of speech. And then it's unclear about, the narrator says, we don't know whether he died that day, or whether he died on Hanukkah, between the different kugels. That's kugel for this, kugel for that, and he was eating so much that he died then. But he dies, and the implication is that it's been Betzalel Moshe's connecting him to the dead fish, which brings about his death as well. That there's something very powerful about true art that Betzalel Moshe gets to, that art can have an influence or an effect. So, in the end, the identity between the fish and Fischl carp is also that they're both speechless. They're both silent. When he has a stroke, he is like the fish, that he loses the power of speech, and also that he dies the way the fish dies as well. So that makes the power of art very strong. But nonetheless, Betzalel Moshe does not benefit from this. He is to use Kafka's phrase, a kind of hunger artist. He now knows how to draw fish much better. He's progressed in his art, but he's still very poor. But at the end of the story, we have a really interesting closure. So, Fischl Karp dies. His family puts up a gravestone, a monument for him in the cemetery, with his name on it and probably some verses about him. And at the top of the gravestone, they put the Mazal Dagim. They put the Pisces, right? He was probably born in that month, and he loved to eat fish and so forth. And who draws the design for the fish? Tzal Moshe. He's become an expert in drawing this. And so he's called upon by the engraver to design it, and then the engraver, the hammer makes the fish. And over time, so we have the narrator now. The narrator is telling the story from a generation or two later. And he says that over time, what happens to gravestones? They sink into the ground.
And
Yeah.
the only sign of the fish.
Only the sign of the fish. So in the end, the irony is that this kind of artistic breakthrough that the artist has is what survives, and not the gluttony and the food and the appetite of Fischl Karp. Even though Bezalel Moshe himself never became important and probably was always hungry, but what he produced in terms of art is what lasted over the generations, or in a sense, we would say in English, he had the last laugh. In other words, the joke was one that he benefited from. And one thing I neglected to mention that's an interesting historical fact is that during these years in Buchach, in the middle of the 1860s, there was in fact the Jews decided not to buy fish from the Gentile fishermen because the price being asked for fish was too high. It was very difficult because eating fish on the Sabbath is very much part of Jewish tradition. Jews love to eat fish on Sabbath, gefilte fish, and all sorts of other things, and holidays as well. It's a sign of good luck, it's a sign of fertility, but as a kind of protest against the exploitation, Jews put a ban or an embargo on fish. And we actually have the responsum, or the teshuvah from the rabbi of Buchach at that time, who is dealing with the question of, is this an issue of Jewish law? Can you can the community compel Jews not to buy fish? And we actually have the answer as well. So this adds another layer to it, that when Fischl buys the fish, he's in a sense violating, going against this communal action to try to bring the price of fish down to a reasonable amount. And when the Gentile fisherman gets the fish, he says, oh my God, if this were usual times when Jews are eating fish, I'd be making a lot of money. But now what am I going to do with this fish? Maybe I can sell it to the priest, who knows, but it's not going to be worth very much money. So for him, it's a great stroke of luck to find Fischl Karp, a Jew who's willing to trespass, to go against the communal decision not to buy fish. So that adds another layer of transgressiveness, of doing something against the law, that's also part of Fischl's grossness and his gluttony. So to try to summarize here, what's interesting to me in my study of the Buchach stories, and as I said, this story comes at the end of the cycle because it's toward the end of the period covered. The period covered is maybe 1670 or 80 to 1860s, is that it's a kind of judgment about Buchach. Buchach has become a place where all people care about is their appetites and material things. It's very much of a critique and a judgment on Buchach. And what escapes, what stands apart from that generalization of Buchach as a place that has declined and become a place where people care about is money and eating. And I would connect this also to the novel, The Simple Story. And something that I should have brought out when we discussed it is Herschel's parents, Cyril and her husband. What did Cyril care about? If you remember, she is a gourmet. She really cares about eating. She's very serious about the dishes she eats. And that is also the narrator's picture of bourgeois life in there. They're concerned about money and counting the money, and they're concerned about eating. Eating is very central to them. And that's also Agnon's depiction of middle-class Jewish life, of in Yiddish, Balabatischkeit. In other words, when Jewish life is all about the good foods on the Sabbath, and about the body, and about sleeping, and about eating, and so forth, that here becomes the epitome, the essence of Buchach. Here it's very grotesque in the case of official carp. But official carp is meant to, again, not to be an exception, but to be an example of Buchach. Now, against that image of Buchach is the artist, the poor artist, the starving artist. But what makes Bezalel Moshe different from official carp, they're connected by the fact that they're both hungry all the time, thinking about food. But Bezalel Moshe is capable of introspection, of thinking, of contemplation, of meditation. The Hebrew term is hitbonanut. Because even though he is hungry all the time, he is still capable of looking at the world, of thinking, contemplating the objects, of trying to transfer them into the medium of drawing and representation. And that's exactly what official carp can't do. Official carp is only his appetites. In that, he resembles the fish in the sense that he is a kind of animal. There's no real difference between official carp as a human being from the fish. He is entirely his appetites. And so the statement, ultimately, the story makes is, what is it that makes us different from the animals? Well, it's what Bezalel Moshe is capable of doing. It's really art. It's really the ability to observe the world, to think about it, to think about yourself, to try to produce something that is not just a material object. That is the only real difference, at least in the world of this story. So in a kind of sad, or there's a tragic sense here, that the world of Buchach has become the world of official carp. And the only way the only way out, the only transcendence, is through something which is not reality, something which is art, not reality in the sense of what is material. That it's only on the level of art that something true can be achieved. What is the real world of Buchach has become debased, become compromised, it's become equated with the animal and with appetite. So there's a tragic part to this and an exception. That exception being the possibility of art transcending the compromised reality. And that is probably a good place for us to bring things to a close. So with a little tragedy and a little hope. And I hope that you will continue to be readers of Agnon. There's much more Agnon in Russian translation, if you look for it on the internet. There's his great novel, Only Yesterday, Tamil Shulshon, and a whole bunch of other things that you'll find as well. And it may take a little searching and research, but I hope that you will continue to read Agnon and other Hebrew and Jewish writers as well. I've enjoyed having the students very much, and I wish you good reading in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.